Greetings, scholars, and welcome back to this another week of Humanities 252. Today we're going to be dispelling some myths about that early Renaissance transition out of the late medieval. Just basically, I'm going to complicate the whole idea of Italy really being the earth, the sun, and the moon, especially during this earliest of pre-Renaissance, early Renaissance times. I've got a couple videos for you in the folder this week, made by other people. You're welcome. But for one, we're going to look at one of Jan van Eyck's, or Jan van Eyck. I don't speak Dutch. Either one I've heard from actual legitimate scholars, so I'll take either when you're chatting about him as well. You've got three different videos looking at his piece of portrait of Arnolfini and his wife that look at it from three really different perspectives. So you've got the opportunity to see just kind of that depth and richness of research potential that every single painting that we study offers. Every single piece of art can be critiqued from the sense of an art critique, like we are translating and understanding that language. From a conservation perspective, you can actually analyze the chemicals, looking at the underdrawings, looking at the materials used, the techniques used. It can give us an idea about technology, what was available, economics and trade of that time, finances. There's a lot that can be looked at both economically and technologically through that kind of approach. Also, cultural inspiration, I suppose. The convex mirror in the particular piece that we're going to look at here in this lecture. There's another video on that, just talking about how that really took off into fashion over the next several centuries and kind of got established as something important for later artistic movements like the Pre-Raphaelites, which we will not be studying this semester, but giving you that idea of that sort of timeline, how tastes and styles and inspirations and hearkening back to great masters and nudging towards what becomes known as a prestige object or a referential object towards some idea or place that you're trying to invoke in paintings, later work. Charles Dickens mentions this painting, and it was a couple hundred years old by the time he got to it, and he's a couple hundred-ish years old by the time we're hearing him reference the ancient thing. So to sort of recognize that these things have meaning and the meaning changes and evolves over that whole time, rather than it's just they painted it when it's new and now we look at it now. There's a whole life that happens in between. And finally, the third one is looking at reconstructing the dress that the wife of Arnolfini is wearing, and how much that has to say about trade and economics and culture and society during that time. So sort of three very different approaches to looking at the same piece of art to get different angles on it. And there's really so many different ways that you can look into a piece of art and critique it and analyze it to say something about the culture, the society, the economics. It can tell us so much. And so that's why we do what we do. So we're here understanding the culture of the era through its art and its literature and what that can tell us about the time and the place. So let's check out this transition. Oh, there's another video in there about ugly babies. So please watch about the ugly babies, because we've got some ugly babies in this presentation, and I think they sum it up in 5 minutes in a pretty solid way, that the homunculus theory is a good one for understanding what art was trying to do. So we will get into this, what art was trying to do, pre-mastering doing this new thing right now. So the medieval transition. art stayed in the quote medieval style, taking a backseat to architecture and literary advancements. I've been harping on about architecture for weeks now. So you are fully aware that Gothic cathedrals are amazing, and that we've made leaps and bounds technologically in architecture. We've also made leaps and bounds in writing and distribution of text. So, art being sort of decorative backup singers to those two major things was the case until the 14th century, which we started to look at last week. Things begin to change. There's a momentum of change that we're going to look at that ends up with being that early Renaissance period by the end of this century. All right, let's have a looky-loo at Byzantine style. So the transition from the Byzantine style, you've got the Cimabue on the left, and it is, as we talked about, vertical symmetry. That's how we like our religious icons, because that's stable and balanced and forever. As you can see, the angels are quite cookie cutter, left, right, left, right, left, right, boom, 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 all the way down. It's pretty stylized in that it's not really meant to look like recognizable real people. You wouldn't be like, oh, Cimabue used Sally from 2 streets down as his model for the Virgin Mary. I mean, doesn't really look like any particular person. It looks like a person, but it's stylized. You've got Madonna having that kind of 3-dimensional lap for the baby to sit on. You've got shading happening. Then as you move to the right with Giotto, he's one of our first that begins to dabble in what art can do. We've got a much more realistically 3-dimensional lap for the baby to sit on. So his mom's knees actually do feel like they are coming out and making a table. Her body takes up space. Shading, we've kind of got some chiaroscuro going on in the shading, certainly of her blue dress, but a couple other points in there, just that deep black being used. The bodies seem to have mass in the Giotto on the right, more so than the one on the left. On the Cimabue on the left, you can see that those angels almost look like they're sort of stacked on each other's shoulders. There's not really a realistically believable amount of space for 4 people to be standing between the back wall and the front of that throne. Whereas in the Giotto there, he's given the front bodies, the ones that you can see, mass. They look like they take up space. And then with that overlapping of people, as well as his sort of more intense vanishing point perspective on that throne that she's sitting on, I find it believable that it's 4 bodies deep or a little bit more between the wall and the front there at the hand, the sides of the chair. So the bodies take up space much more believably, realistically in Giotto's on the right. Also notice that the throne is on the ground in Giotto's. There's floor to stand on, and there's 2 angels on the floor in front of the throne. It's adding to that illusion of 3-dimensional space. And, basic linear perspective. We've got kind of an attempt on it in the Cimabue on the left, but not really. We've given some rounded archness to where her feet rest, but then the arch on the bottom there looks like it's part of a ceiling, not actually lipping back to be a horizontal depth of space. Whereas in the Giotto, he's got floor and some steps, and then the throne where we've got quite an extreme vanishing point perspective on the 2 arms of the throne, that it really does make a believable 3-dimensional sense of space. Not to mention, we've made leaps and bounds in this, 20-year period of realism in the faces. I'm still not totally convinced that I could recognize uh, Britney from Three Houses Down if she was the model for Madonna, but there's certainly a lot more of an attempt with that shape, shading, and shadow to give you realistic human faces, recognizable human faces. Um, so we've made some leaps and bounds. And what we're going to see with Giotto here is he also is attempting to give us stuff that you can't really, it's better than real life. It's better than a photograph because he can show you things that most people have never seen. Um, we've got golden halos illuminating off of people's heads. We're going to get a little bit more into that baby. That baby is supposed to be the Christ child. It's Jesus. And we've got kind of this passage that is really glomped onto during this period for how do we depict Christ as a fully formed man who is just born. So he's already always the thing that he becomes. So he's already the omnipotent Son of God being. How do you show that in a baby? How do you show that without having it look like a helpless, pooping, drooling baby? It's pretty impossible. That's a very tall order, and that's why it sort of got settled on and popularized with the homunculus theory, which literally means little man. So the little short video in the folder gets a bit more into that, but recognizing that he's trying to fit a lot of things into this depiction that you don't see in real life. Every baby is not the Christ child. So you know what a baby looks like, but do you know what the Son of God looks like? Tricky, tall order. And he is attempting to show us that in the art. He's attempting to show us miracles in the art. So that is that movement towards the Renaissance. All right. So, Annunciation. We've got the Martini and Memmi altarpiece here. We are going to be covering some isms that are starting to develop in the art of the 14th century that are what the Renaissance is all about. And one of those isms is humanism. In medieval religious art, it really only focused on the divinity of Christ, the divinity, the divine, not human, not like us nature of the people that it depicted. It's depicting Jesus and Mary and angels and saints, and they're not meant to be just like us. So they don't really look just like us, and we can't imagine to begin to know how they feel about things. Whereas humanism is this movement where there's more of a focus on the struggles of a fragile human existence and remembering that Jesus Christ was a man on this earth for 33 years, maybe. So we've got this focus on his human life and the fact that Mary is a human woman. Like, she's just a girl. Mind you, an important girl, as you remember from the Jesse Tree genealogical lineage. She married into a very important family, and it's totally reasonable that they would have been chosen for this great responsibility. But she's still a girl. And that's something that we've never really focused on before this early transition into what would become the Renaissance. So check out this girl here in her very dark blue robe, seated on a throne or a chair. You've got an annunciation. So any annunciation, if I show you just like a blank screen and I'm like, what's an annunciation? It is when the angel comes down and announces to Mary that she's pregnant. So that is an annunciation. This is that before Jesus was born moment. If we flip back to this, these are Madonna enthroned. Madonna and the baby, when it's enthroned and we're surrounded by angels and usually saints and things, the only time we're all having a happy reunion would be in heaven. So this is after all the action and events of the Bible when everybody is dead and ascended to heaven. And yet we weirdly have the baby situation again, but now you see the stress on the artist for depicting the baby and the man and the whole thing that has already always happened. Yeah, not an easy task. Whereas here we just very simply have Mary finding out that she is pregnant with the Christ child, and not to be afraid. However, what's the first thing you do when somebody's like, now don't panic? Usually nobody says that in a situation that isn't panic worthy. So this is a great annunciation from the early 14th century where we get to see Mary not like just looking angelically calm and pleased. She's kind of pulling her cloak back. She's recoiling from the angel. She looks unhappy, possibly a little nauseous. We've given it this humanism. We've actually sat and thought for a minute about how would you feel? How did Mary feel when an angel comes down from heaven? Pretty overwhelming. Has a conversation with her, pretty overwhelming. That she's pregnant with the Christ child, the savior of mankind. Pretty overwhelming. So we get this humanistic approach to this really intimate moment for Mary in her life where she gets to have a reaction that isn't all just calm and public and positive. So this is that first sort of hint at movement towards humanism, which is, again, that focus on the human existence, the fragility of human life, the human existence of Mary, and the saints and Christ's time on earth. You'll see here as well, this is a flat altarpiece, and we could have just pretended like it was a flat space, but Martini and Memmi have given us some depth here by painting in a floor and a piece of planted livelihood. We got a potted plant, and it's in the back, and it's sort of believably spaced that it's wall, potted plant, Mary, and the angel. So we've got some depth of space being built there with just a hint of perspective. One of the isms that is going to get developed a little bit more refined is naturalism. And we're going to be thinking about and focusing on nature. I don't know if I would full on say that that's naturalism right there, but slap in some potted plants, greenery, or shrubbery into stuff was an early attempt at like nature. So I might say that there's a nod towards proto-naturalism happening here as well. All right, so this is some of the stuff happening in the South. Giotto was incredibly important to this early pre-Renaissance time period, this transition in the 14th century. And we saw him with his altarpiece here on the right. He is starting to look at how we depict things in believable ways that are perhaps even unbelievable, like miracles and angels and stuff that we just kind of have been doing symbolically before this. And now, how do you do something that's out of this world, but realistically, when that's sort of two separate ideas to glue together? I mean, it's so natural to us now. You watch incredibly realistic sci-fi and fantasy movies all the time. We're used to CGI and special effects, and you're like, yeah, but that alien planet just didn't really look realistic enough in blah, blah, blah. We owe this being able to sort of wrap our minds around feeling reality around unreal images and events and environments to this early Renaissance 14th century transition where artists were experimenting with how to believably depict stuff that they've never seen before. All right. Meanwhile, in the north, the Flemish primitives is a very Renaissance Italian centric way of sort of smack talking the amazing pre-Renaissance movements in the north. Here you see this is early 15th century, but I just wanted to show you the culmination of the Northern Renaissance. Jan van Eyck was like a heavy hitter of the Northern Renaissance, and this is that painting that we're focusing on this week. Arnolfini and his wife. This was originally called the Marriage of Arnolfini, or the Arnolfini Wedding Portrait, but as it's been helpfully pointed out by certain historians, she died the year before this was painted. So memorial pieces where you still paint family members into the family portraits, even if they're already dead, very common, because you don't have an album full of candid snapshots of photographs to remember the people. And it's sort of also a way of saying that, you know, Timmy is still part of this family. So we just full on paint Timmy into the family portrait, even if he's already passed. So having this moment of, I don't know, marital remembrance, this was perhaps, you know, part of that status that Mr. Arnolfini was trying to hold on to. You know, having a family portrait with no children, because they didn't have any, is maybe less of a vanity moment than just getting your own portrait painted again. Van Eyck did Arnolfini's individual portrait as well. I guess it's kind of that like selfie versus do you actually have another human being on earth that would take your picture for you? Now, up those stakes, do you have another human being on this earth that would also be in that picture with you? So this kind of, I think, a little bit of the social implications we're dealing with here. The North is all about details. We've got fine detail, teeny tiny detail, literally things that you actually need a magnifying glass to fully appreciate. If you look at that convex mirror in the center of the painting, that is the featured item in the short video that you're going to be watching this week. There's the back of Arnolfini and his wife, as well as a portrait of Jan van Eyck at his easel painting this picture, all within that mirror. So it's a portrait of two people and a dog, but it's actually a portrait. There's 5 portraits in it, plus a dog, so 6. So it's incredibly detailed. There's sort of a lot of mystery of actually exposing the sort of behind this camera frame angle of that convex mirror image reflected at us. I am so sorry. Like, I should have shushed my email before we started this banana business. Right. So that's Van Eyck being able to do incredible things with detail. Notice the Persian rug on the floor and how much color and detail he has put into that weaving. Notice that you can even see the pinked cut details on her dress and right down to the individual hairs on the edges of his fur cloak. Insane level of detail. And that's not what you're seeing in the South right now. And that is a technology issue. The North has oil paints. We're going to talk a little bit more about that next week when I sort of like throw down the gauntlet to confuse all of these nice clear-cut North versus South and this century and that century moments. So I'll let you orient yourselves to this before I kind of throw a hand grenade into it. But Jan van Eyck has been credited as the inventor of oil paint technology. That is not true. He probably took it to a new level unlike anyone else, so he definitely deserves some credit. But oil paints have been used in Afghanistan since the 7th century, so he's taking basically 600-700-year-old technology from Central Asia and perfecting it, refining it, using it in new ways. And why would he know about stuff like that? Well, as we're going to learn next week, some of the pigments that were used in these portraits and were being traded in art circles throughout Europe, they only come from Afghanistan. So the trade just to get the simple raw materials would have also inevitably brought technology, information, some cultural, at least hints at the culture from whence it came through, you know, travel and journaling, chatting, trading. So these sort of hints at that technology. Jan van Eyck was not the first oil painter, but oil paints really get refined and perfected in the north during this time. The Italians did not have oil paints in the 14th century. So they could not have such an obsession with detail like these northern painters could. Jan is definitely the king of them at this moment, but if you notice, that level of detail is incredible. And within that detail, he is able to tell whole enigmatic, mysterious stories in the symbolism and the tiny little like Easter eggs that he planted all over this painting. I'm not going to get into all of them here. We could do like a whole week on this painting, which, I mean, weirdly, we kind of are because you've got 3 other videos on this very one painting. But I really don't want to spoil most of that for you. I've already kind of like cracked the this isn't a wedding portrait. I'm also going to slag off that she's not pregnant. People used to think that she's holding her dress up like that because she's pregnant. She's not. I mean, let's be honest, she's dead and they never had kids. So, nope. But you see the fruit on the windowsill. People have said those are symbols of fertility. I would argue that they are symbols of his wealth. Do you know what it takes to get oranges up to Amsterdam in winter? Money. Lots and lots of money. You can see that Persian rug on the floor. Money. Look at his fur-lined cloak. Money. Look at her absurd, massive, bright green, expensive dyed, expensive wool, lined with either, it's been argued, just the bellies of red squirrels or a couple hundred Arctic fox. So again, imports, money, consumption, money. He is part of this emerging middle class. We've been talking about the emerging middle class that had all the money but none of the status. And that was certainly true in the very Catholic South. But up in the north, especially places like Amsterdam that were serious merchant hubs for the whole of the known world at that point, people like the Italian Arnolfini could move to the north, and there was a certain baked in stature to just the wealth moment in these not kingdoms, not super Catholic places. So the balance of power and authority was very different in the north. So there was a place for somebody like Arnolfini to really aspire to a fine level of living and have a bit of stature. However, there was that idea of modesty and this sort of Protestant ethic of not being a lad about town. So you didn't want to throw your money around and be like gaudy. So there were a lot of social issues of like, yes, I have money, but I'm trying not to be gross about it. Van Eyck was the court painter. So he understood those social nuances very, very well. So for him to be doing these private paintings for wealthy merchants, he could help sort of navigate painting this picture to say like, yeah, obviously it took like millions of dollars just to put the clothes on our backs and furnish this one small corner of our room. But, you know, we're not being gaudy about it. So trying to show that humility, trying to show, I don't know, I guess just social graces. So a lot of complex things are going on here about consumerism, society, class that tell us a lot about the culture of the time and really what was happening. Weirdly, This portrait takes place in a bedroom. That's their bed on the right side. I find that a bit awkward. But that's, my modern eye. But I also feel like kind of buttoned up individuals would feel that was weird at any given time of any century. It's intimate. It's an intimate scene. We've got a Saint Margaret carved in the corner of the bedpost over there. Um, we've got a dog that was added later, as you'll see from the analysis of the underpainting. So loyalty, faithfulness, or maybe it was just legit their dog. Um, so green symbol represents hope, or maybe it's just a really expensive color to have. There's a lot of ways that this piece can be read. I don't expect you to do it without support. So I'm interested to see what you think after you've watched those other 3 videos. I just wanted to, a simple scene like this. I mean, honestly, the first time I ever saw this painting, knowing it was so famous, I was just like, wow, that is one ugly dude. What is with that nose? And that was, my teenage self the first time I saw it was just like, meh, ugly dude. Why doesn't he have eyebrows? And then to continue to come back to it and realize just how complicated, how actually quite strange this piece is, makes it like no wonder people have been talking about this thing for a couple hundred years. All right, Jan van Eyck's not the only game in the northern town, so let's look at some other oil painters from the latter half here. We've got Robert Campen. This is an altarpiece. It's called the Merode Altarpiece. That's a nickname. It's an Annunciation. So, who are our players? That's right. We have to have an angel, and we have to have Mary, and Mary needs to be pregnant. How do we explain that in an image? Well, we use symbolism up in the north. We've got a lot going on in here. So check out the white washcloth in the back next to a pot of clean water. That is a symbol of virginity and purity. So that white towel with a bowl of water next to it, you might see that in other religious items. That is just like shorthand for purity, virginity. Mary must be in the room. We've got an Annunciation here, in case I left that as a, I wonder what's happening. It's an Annunciation. Notice how the faces, while they still do have more detail than, say, that 1290 Cimabue, they've kind of still got like a Byzantine flatness to them. Like, in order to show Mary and angels, you shouldn't make them look like Sally from down the street, because then that would make her a real girl, and there's something blasphemous about that. So we still kind of make the faces almost Byzantine in like being just like flat faces. But we've made them both little ginger blonde Flemish girls, which is an interesting choice. So based on their dress, I mean, check out the folds of that very starched, I'm going to say wool, question mark, because the wool trade, real big during this period. So fancy ladies would have had ultra thin doe skin wool, and it would have been very fine, and you could have gotten it starched like that. Wonderful details on the cloth draping and folding. But we've got a middle class Flemish girl as Mary reading her Bible like a good middle class Flemish girl. Mary, mother of Christ, couldn't have possibly read the Bible because no one started it till much later. But that's okay. Details, right? So we got a lot going on here, because then we're sort of making parallels rather than trying to give you a documentary style realism, right? So we've set it in a different place and time because it maybe connects with our target audience a bit better. And how do we shorthand that like Mary was a holy and worthy woman? Well, good holy worthy women these days, they read their Bibles. Right. So we've got inconsistencies in the perspective as well, not just the situation. So inconsistency in perspective. We've got either an error because he doesn't know how to do vanishing point perspective, or perhaps he's drawing our attention via distortion. I'm really on the fence about this one. We got oil paints here, so the amount of detail that you're looking at could only be achieved with this. So again, only the North can you get something like this before the High Renaissance kicks off, and they have that technology exchange. So, note, symbolism. Sometimes it's subtle, like that white cloth and bowl of water symbolizing virginity. You will also notice here in the Arnolfini, if you look up at the chandelier, there's a single candle and it's lit. That normally stands for the presence of God. So the Lord has blessed his union. They are actually married, as it were. Here we've got a candle on the table, and it appears to have just gone out. We've got the smoke flittering up. If you'll notice, it is perhaps because the actual presence of actual God has just torpedoed through the closed window on the far left. If you look, there's a teeny tiny baby Jesus careening at high speed directly towards Mary's womb. Perhaps, this is the moment of conception, inception, whatever happens with a virgin birth. And he's already carrying a crucifix, the instrument of his own death. So it's the whole story again wrapped up in a different way. Rather than doing the homunculus situation like they were doing in the South, like Giotto was trying to perfect, the North, this is just another way to sort of encapsulate that whole was already complete to begin with. It was a virgin birth. It just became as opposed to begat. And the story of his whole life was sort of already written with this sacrifice for all of us. So he's got a crucifix and he's on his way to his mother, who's just finding out that she's going to have him. Maybe perhaps not necessarily pregnant, but rather being announced that she will give birth to the Christ child. So we've got humanism and realism here, that we're trying to create a realistic sense of space. And we're also trying to tell this story. I mean, clearly less humanism in this Annunciation as far as Mary getting to have a genuine reaction, instead of the Martini and Memmi where she looks full on nauseous. This one isn't listening. So maybe it's that moment where she's going to feel something funny happen when that little baby Jesus gets to her womb, and then the angel gives her the news, and then stuff happens after that. So this could be that calm before the storm. But it's creating a humanistic environment where you're just sitting there with your elbow up on a couch minding your own business when suddenly. But one thing that we don't have as far as isms here, this is the North, we do not have classicism. And this is going to be one of those keys that the Renaissance happens in the North and the South vaguely around the same time, but they're not the same stylistic movements because we've got different values, a little bit different culture, a little bit different religious and social environment. So we don't have classicism. The Renaissance here does not mean rebirth of the Greek and Roman ideologies. We're just not that into the Greeks and Romans up north because they're not our heritage, I guess. I don't know why I'm speaking for we. So we have humanism and realism happening in the North, but not classicism. Nobody here is trying to look like a Greek or Roman classical figure. Meanwhile, however, we're looking deeper into this Renaissance period because I want to sort of show you what we're looking for on the timeline so that when you're looking at earlier stuff, you can spot it. Here, you've got the humanism, you've got realism. We tried to make realistic people and faces and expressions, a realistic narrative through how people are interacting, a realistic sense of space. We've got natural movement. We've also got a little splash of actual nature. And then you've got this classicism where we've inexplicably set the adoration in some Roman ruins. So you got some Roman aqueduct action or a temple or something on the far left, where in the middle the manger is built out of Roman ruins. So we've added this classicism element, adding sort of that nod back to classical Greek and Roman heights of style. All right, so this is back in Italy because we've got that classicism going on. But this is a great moment because Botticelli is one of the guys that brings it all together. He studied with the Flemish up in Flanders for a while. So we've got some North and South fusion going on here. But he's still at heart very Italian. We got Roman ruins going on. For the realism and starting to change that whole idea of Sally down the street. It's not Sally down the street, it's the Medicis. He used important Florentines as his models for every single person in this piece. So everybody here has some form of political clout. You've got the head of the Medici family being the one who's getting to like tickle the baby Jesus's feet. Big deal to put yourself at the birth of the Christ child. So we've got what is normally a linear procession. If you're looking at an adoration piece, we've got just like this casual crowd going on. That's because this is way more of a political landmine for Botticelli than just doing a regular stylized adoration, because these are all actual people that you would recognize around Florence during this period. So he can't really make the pecking order for who's first, second, fourth, and 12th in line. So we got this casual circling of all the greats and goods of Florence during his lifetime, and mostly who have paid for this privilege. And there's that realism there, and it adds that political layer that didn't previously exist. You know, even with the Campen piece, I don't know if I would recognize who the models were for that. They're sort of deliberately flattened and stylized a bit. Whereas here, these look like people. These look like recognizable people. Backing up, we've got the Annunciation means that the angel is coming to tell Mary that she's going to give birth to the Christ child. So Annunciation, to announce something. Adoration, that is to adore. This is where everybody gets to meet the baby Jesus who has just been born. So the Magi are the three wise men. So adoration, or adoration of the Magi, is that first crowd of folk who come to look upon the newly born baby Jesus. So this is sort of fast forwarding a little less than a year from an Annunciation scene, where you get to show the people coming to adore the child. Versus Madonna Enthroned, those look very similar, but note that it's always only angels and saints, which means that it's always only after the fact up in heaven, which is the only place that that kind of reunion could happen, so everybody's dead. Adoration scenes are a lot more fun because, you know, everybody's alive, in my opinion. That makes it fairly less morose. But note here, Botticelli's putting in the greats and goods. He's quite a young man when he does this piece, and he throws himself in as a self-portrait. What an ambitious little boy. He puts himself in league with the elites. Everybody else there is a serious mover and shaker in Florence at the time, and then he's like, yeah, me too. And he's the one who sort of does that nod to engagement that brings you back to interacting with the piece, or at least interacting with him as sort of a form of commentary in that sense. Like he's making eye contact with you. He recognizes you as the viewer. So the High Renaissance, which is what we're leading up to after the midterm, by the way, is upon us by the time that this upstart little ambitious kid grows up as an artist. So Botticelli as an adult and a middle-aged man He is part of the High Renaissance movement. This piece here is sort of one of those last flashes before the High Renaissance is upon us. So I hope that it's not that confusing where I bookend like this, but I think that that is a very useful way for you to be able to see where stuff is going so that you can recognize the steps in between. So we are going to once again revisit this 14th through 15th century next week, but with this bookended idea of where it came from in the Gothic era and where it's going right at that midnight before the High Renaissance begins. So looking for the isms, you've got humanism, realism happening in the North and the South. You've got naturalism, mostly South, but I'm not going to say it was exclusive to the South. What was exclusive to the South was classicism. The Northerns just weren't really all that hot and excited about bringing back the Greeks and Romans because hashtag not my history. Whereas the Italians are the Romans' descendants, so they're like, yeah, Rome was awesome. So it's a huge part of what the High Renaissance comes to symbolize for the South and never really is a thing in the North. I think the hints there at that sort of Catholic Church centric zone in the South were kind of building up for like, who's the major donors? Who's the major patrons? It's going to stay about the same versus the North where you're seeing that the burgeoning middle class is starting to get their social moment. Certainly during Chaucer's lifetime, it was still a hard line to walk. But over the next sort of 100, 200 years, we're seeing that that status starts to get baked into this burgeoning middle class that are always trying to aspire, I suppose, to the peerage, the landed nobility that they aren't. But they sort of can afford to copy it. You know, I mean, who's wearing the Gucci and the Fendi? And then it sort of trickles down to the fact that, like, I saw Calvin Klein on, like, clearance at TJ Maxx or something. And I'm like, the trickle down is real. Calvin Klein probably isn't special to you guys. In the 90s, that was, like, fancy. Anyway, so we still kind of do that, like what movie stars wear, then wealthy not movie stars wear, then eventually you see it at TJ Maxx on the clearance rack. And that's kind of that kind of aspirational mobility would not have even been allowed because there were laws about what you could wear and what you could do and what you could look like in place during feudal system. And when the middle class arise, that social mobility kind of gets blurred. And it takes a long time, but it happens. Right. So the other takeaway before we cut for this week is without anything in front of you, can you tell me what a Madonna enthroned looks like? We got those key elements of Madonna, the Virgin Mary. Those are her two names. We've got the baby on her lap. We've got the angels and the heavenly hosts, and you get the time frame for that. Happens in heaven. If there's an annunciation, it's the announcement of being with child. So we've got Mary there and an angel letting her know. And then sometimes some way of trying to show us the presence of the Holy Spirit. If we've got an adoration or an adoration of the Magi, we are adoring the newly born baby, possibly in a manger, possibly later on. Sometimes it's a bouncing baby toddler. But that adoration is the baby is born, people come to adore it. So those are kind of three Virgin Mary, Madonna-based scenes that we're going to be seeing a lot of over the next several hundred years. They're popular images to recreate. Right, so enjoy the rest of the videos in this folder, and we will talk soon.